So in Western politics lately, we've been discussing war memorials and general statues and what role they really serve today, especially because a lot of the figures or the groups they celebrated when they were established have become very controversial in the public eye, and most of them for good reason. Of course, a lot of them are monuments to racist empires where minorities and general non-white people who weren't part of the ruling class in those empires didn't really have a say about their establishment. They weren't asked how they felt or anything, and people have got in trouble for graffitiing and defacing some of these monuments. But a really interesting story came out last week, it's probably a couple weeks when this video goes live, of Canadian war memorials getting vandalised, but they actually commemorated both members of the SS and Ukrainian fascists. So this in general is a super interesting story. So what I'm going to do in this video is explain the recent controversy, explain why there are monuments in Canada of all places to the SS and to Ukrainian fascists who fought against the Allies. And then I'm going to talk about why the Ukrainian and Ukrainian Canadian communities are okay with this, and I'm going to talk about how this has been allowed to exist for so long. Because you would think in countries like Canada, where thousands and thousands of soldiers died fighting fascists, fighting the Nazis, you think they wouldn't allow the establishment of monuments which celebrate the people who killed soldiers of Canada. But before we go any further, if you like my content, please leave a like on the video, maybe subscribe to the channel. Also, please check out my Patreon and my social media links in the description. So let's just frame the recent controversy. Now, this was a news article which blew up my Twitter a couple weeks ago. So it's by the Ottawa Citizen and is titled "Graffiti on Monument Commemorating Nazi SS Division Being Investigated as a Hate Crime by Police." So a monument to people who committed hate crimes gets graffitied, and then that gets called a hate crime. So David Pugley's reporting, an incident involving graffiti spray painted on a monument to those who fought in Adolf Hitler's SS is being investigated as a hate crime by an Ontario police force. Someone painted Nazi war monument on a stone cenotaph commemorating those who served with the 14th SS Division. The monument is located in Oakville in the St. Volodymyr Ukrainian Cemetery. The division, made up of Ukrainians who pledged allegiance to Hitler, was part of the Nazis' Waffen-SS organization. Some members of the division have been accused of killing Polish women and children, as well as Jews during the Second World War. Houghton Regional Police believe the graffiti was spray painted on the cenotaph sometime around June 21st. Police said they were investigating the incident as a hate-motivated crime, but they declined to release images of the graffiti to stop further spreading of the message. So it's obviously super concerning that it was treated as a hate crime to begin with. I think that reveals a lot of problem with this community's racism and the police force who deemed it a hate crime. But thankfully they did backtrack, and people were saying, how can you commit a hate crime by graffitiing monuments to the SS? So you might be wondering, who set up this monument, this specific one we're talking about? So on the 26th of May 1988, Monument to the Glory of the UPA, a memorial to the members of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, was erected soon after a cenotaph was erected displaying the emblem of the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, the 1st Galatian, an inscription dedicating it to those who died for the freedom of Ukraine. So we're also going to talk about the Ukrainian Insurgent Army in this video, which was a guerrilla group which was fascist on its own, but also collaborated with the Nazis. And of course, these were erected by members of the Ukrainian Canadian community, a lot of whom had fought in the war against the Soviet Union and had been welcomed to Canada following it. Of course, if you know your history, it's not surprising. The Allies largely derailed a lot of the trials of Nazi war criminals. They in fact welcomed those who had a lot of expertise. For example, everyone knows about NASA, the Soviets did it as well, picking up the top scientists from the V1 and V2 programs to help with the space programs. But it wasn't limited to rocket scientists, people who developed weapons. Lots of different people were recruited by the Allies afterwards. And of course, when you're no longer being hunted for war crimes or for being part of the SS, you're pretty much free to move around. So of course, a lot of former SS or Ukrainian fascists easily moved to the West. And of course, it helps a bit more that the people these guys were largely killing was the Soviet Union and Soviet Union allies such as Polish communists. So you didn't really care what they'd done because the Soviet Union were now the big bad guys. So just like in my videos about Rommel and the rehabilitation of the German army, it was all about rearming West Germany and stopping any animosity between the Allies and the former Axis. So that's why they went to great lengths to either bury a lot of the war crimes that the fascists generally did. They wanted the Allies to get on board with supporting West Germany and supporting the border against the Eastern Bloc. So looking back on it now, it's pretty disgusting how much these people who supposedly led the fight for freedom in the Western governments really helped rehabilitate fascists and really didn't dedicate their fight to so-called justice to after the war because they became obsessed with anti-communism. Just another unfortunate incidence of how far anti-communism often brainwashes these people and makes them side with fascists. We of course saw that in the Cold War with Allies siding with Franco and various fascist dictators in Central and Latin America. So to take it back to the monuments in Canada, The Nation did a really good report, so I'm going to read some of it now. So the monument in question is a cenotaph honouring members of the SS Galician division of the Waffen-SS, the Nazi Party's military branch, whose long list of war crimes includes the Holocaust. And then it goes on to say, it's unfortunate that SS Galician was an actual unit in the SS deemed important enough to receive a personal visit from Heinrich Himmler, and Himmler himself said to them that he's happy he can let them go and commit war crimes against the Poles because he knows the Ukrainians always wanted to do that, and he was of course a principal architect of the Holocaust. So during his speech to rally the Ukrainian SS troops, Himmler waxed poetic about how much better off Ukraine was with the Jews exterminated and mused about the fighters' willingness to slaughter Poles. SS Galician recruitment posters proudly featured Hitler. There's no doubt about just who it is that Oakville Memorial honours. So what is also interesting, this isn't unique to this one location, so The Nation also reporting, but the truly unfortunate thing is that Oakville's monument is only one of several glorifying Nazi collaborators and butchers of Jews scattered throughout Canada. Edmonton has a bust of Roman Shukovich, who was in charge of a nationalist battalion serving as Nazi auxiliaries that later morphed into the German Auxiliary Police Battalion. These units took part in lethal anti-Semitic violence and brutal counter-insurgent suppression. Shukovich also commanded the Ukrainian insurgent army, so we're going to get onto them in a sec, which killed Jews and systematically massacred 70 to 100,000 Poles. The Oakville Cemetery has a prominent UPA monument as well. So just to talk about the UPA for a sec before we get into Ukrainian politics. So the Ukrainian Insurgent Army was a Ukrainian nationalist paramilitary and later partisan formation. During World War II, it was engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Soviet Union, the Polish underground state, Communist Poland and Nazi Germany, which is an interesting wrinkle that they actually fought the Nazis as well. It was established by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. The insurgent army arose out of a separate militant formation of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalist Bandera faction and other militant national patriotic formations, with some former defectors of the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police, which we just spoke about. So during its existence, the Ukrainian insurgent army fought against the Poles and the Soviets as their primary opponents, although the organisation also fought against the Germans starting from February 1943, with many cases of collaboration with the German forces in the fight against Soviet partisan units. From spring 1944, the UPA, faced with Soviet advances, also cooperated with German forces against the Soviets and Poles in the hope of creating an independent Ukrainian state. So this is also another interesting part, is that they existed long after the war. So after the end of World War II, the Polish Communist Army fought extensively against the UPA. The UPA remained active and fought against the People's Republic of Poland until 1947 and against the Soviet Union until 1949. So that is obviously quite a fascinating group in terms of they are fascists who both fought the communists but also at times fought the Germans because I guess they were primarily nationalists. Now I always knew there was fascist movements in Ukraine during the war. It's actually pretty insane to think about Ukraine being fought over by the Soviets and the Nazis and having all these other parts of politics going on in the background. But it's even clear today, of course, Ukraine absolutely hates Russia, and of course at the time it absolutely hated the Soviet Union for things like the Holocaust, which obviously killed loads of Ukrainians, and the animosity really hasn't gone away, so it's not surprising there were massive nationalist movements. But of course at the time, nationalism in Eastern Europe or anywhere in Europe really goes hand in hand with anti-Semitism, so it's not surprising the UPA often helped the Nazis. But of course their willingness to fight the Nazis at times shows that their main goal was creating a fascist Ukrainian state rather than necessarily becoming part of a greater Reich. Now you might also be thinking, why would Ukrainians erect monuments to the SS, from which many Ukrainians fought in, and also the UPA in Canada? Well, it's because even in Ukraine, these people are recognised in a positive way. While many nationalists in particular love the SS division, which the Ukrainians fought in, the government and country in general recognise the UPA and various guerrilla groups that collaborate with the Nazis as people who were freedom fighters, and their struggle eventually resulted in the independence of Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union. Viktor Yushchenko submitted a draft law on the official status of fighters for Ukraine's independence from the 1920s to the 1990s. Under the draft, persons who took part in political, guerrilla, underground and combat activities for the freedom and independence of Ukraine from 1920 to 1990, or as part of the following: the Ukrainian military organization, the OUN, the UPA, and the Ukrainian Main Liberation Army, will be recognised as war veterans. On the 15th of May 2015, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko signed a bill into law that provides public recognition to anyone who fought for Ukrainian independence in the 20th century, including Ukrainian insurgent army combatants. In Kiev, the UPA flag may be displayed on government buildings on certain holidays. In December 2018, Poroshenko confirmed the status of veterans and combatants for the independence of Ukraine for UPA fighters. So it's clear why Ukrainian Canadians may feel they should erect monuments to groups like the UPA and to a lesser extent the SS, because they see it as part of their history for the struggle of independence from the Soviet Union. Now, of course, not all Ukrainian nationalist movements collaborate with the Nazis, but it's quite disturbing that it doesn't seem to faze their recognition of them, that these groups slaughtered so many Jews and Poles. But it also speaks to the tolerance of these groups as well by Western powers, because how has this gone unnoticed for so long? I guess because the cemetery was for Ukrainians and these groups are pretty celebrated in Ukraine, I guess that's why people never probably took a notice to them. But of course it's pretty disturbing to see monuments in an allied country to people who fought and killed Allied soldiers, whether they be communist Poles, whether they be Soviet soldiers or Jewish partisans. Again, it shows the complicity of the West in that we accept that stuff, and we've been so brainwashed by anti-communism. At certain times, we accept fascism and we promote fascism. It's nothing new, like I've been saying. We allied with Franco in the Cold War. We allied with all these awful fascists in places like Cuba, Nicaragua, in places in Asia. We had no problem doing that as long as they were anti-communist, because the communists have always been the biggest threat to the capitalists. And of course it's a historical debate that Churchill and the Allies actually waited way too long to open up a second front, because they were hoping that Hitler and Stalin would just wipe each other out, because they saw the threat of communism as still something that was very great, even though fascism was the main threat of the day. And what is also interesting is that when the Soviet Union invaded Finland, the British government actually wanted to declare war on both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Of course, they did not have the resources for a fight against two of them, but it shows you how anti-communism has often trumped everything. Now, I'm not saying animosity from Ukrainians to Russians and Russia today isn't legitimate, but what my problem generally is that I guess you don't have to honour people who did such awful fascist violence and collaborated with one of the most evil regimes in modern history. But yeah, it's pretty disturbing, and I think these monuments should be taken down. The SS one is a no-brainer, but when you go into the history of the UPA as well, it's pretty clear that should not stand in a country like Canada. Of course, I don't think it should stand in any country, but when you have the Ukrainian government recognising the people who fought in these groups as veterans and freedom fighters, you can't really do anything about it. And due to the general anti-Russian sentiment now, I'm sure that is not a political debate you're ever going to win in Ukraine. But overall, I found this topic super interesting. I love really weird topics like this. You know, who would have thought you'd have SS monuments in Canada? I'm sure there's other things like this throughout the world which would be interesting to hear about. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please like the video, maybe subscribe to the channel. Check me out on social media at The Tabernacle, mainly on Twitter, but also on Instagram and Facebook. Please check out my Reddit, so r/TheTabernacle for my subreddit. u/TommyCahill1995 for my personal Reddit. Check out my Patreon in the description. Check out my WordPress and Medium as well. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.